The First Continental Congress, Part 1, The Call to Philadelphia. Imagine this, the year is 1774. The streets of Boston are silent, broken only by the clatter of British soldiers' boots and the faint cry of hungry children. The once bustling harbor, Boston's lifeline, is sealed off, blockaded by the Royal Navy. No ships sail in, no goods come out. The Crown, as people call the distant king in London, has tightened its fist. The punishment for Boston's defiance of British authority has arrived. Parliament calls it the Coercive Acts, but to the people in the colonies, they're known by another name, the Intolerable Acts. For laws designed to crush rebellion and remind the colonies who's in charge. The Boston Port Act, closing the harbor until the destroyed tea is paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act, dissolving local democracy and placing the colony under military rule. The Administration of Justice Act, allowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried not in the colonies, but back in England, where they'd surely be acquitted. And finally, the Quartering Act, forcing colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. To many, this is tyranny, plain and simple. Until now, the 13 colonies had lived mostly separate lives. They spoke the same language, yes, and they shared similar dreams, but each had its own governor, its own economy, its own troubles. Virginia planters didn't always see eye to eye with New England merchants, and South Carolina's rice plantations seemed a world away from Pennsylvania's bustling towns. But when the news of Boston's suffering spread, something remarkable began to stir. From Georgia to New Hampshire, people read the same reports in their newspapers, and for the first time, they began to feel that an attack on one colony was an attack on all. In the taverns of Philadelphia, men argued passionately over mugs of ale. In the churches of Virginia, ministers preached about liberty and divine justice. And in the public squares of New York and Charleston, people gathered to protest, sign petitions, and send supplies to help the starving people of Boston. The sense of shared destiny was growing, and it was about to change everything. It was the Virginia House of Burgesses, ever proud of its role as the oldest representative assembly in America, that first proposed a general meeting of the colonies. In May 1774, after Governor Dunmore dissolved the House for condemning the Intolerable Acts, the representatives simply met anyway, this time in a tavern. There, in defiance of royal authority, they agreed that all colonies should send delegates to a Continental Congress to coordinate their response to Britain. The idea spread like wildfire. Committees of correspondence, those networks of patriots who kept the colonies connected, sent letters, messages, and riders galloping from town to town. By late summer, 12 colonies, all except Georgia, had agreed to send delegates to meet in Philadelphia. Some went reluctantly, others went eagerly. But all knew this was something historic. Never before had the colonies met together as equals, united for a single purpose. They didn't yet speak of independence, not openly, at least. The word independence was still dangerous, almost treasonous. Most colonists still saw themselves as loyal subjects of King George III. They wanted justice, not separation. But the tone was shifting. The very act of gathering together, outside of royal control, was revolutionary in itself. Throughout the summer of 1774, dusty roads filled with riders and carriages carrying men whose names would soon echo through history. From Virginia came George Washington, tall, solemn, dressed in his militia uniform, riding with Patrick Henry, fiery and fearless, and Richard Henry Lee, the man who would later move for independence. From Massachusetts, still reeling from the occupation of Boston, came John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams, two men whose tempers burned as hot as their tea had once boiled in the harbor. Alongside them rode Robert Treat Paine and Thomas Cushing, representing a people on the brink of rebellion. From Pennsylvania, there was John Dickinson, the cautious scholar who had once written letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, pleading for reconciliation, and Joseph Galloway, a man who still believed in the possibility of peace with Britain. From South Carolina came the wealthy and eloquent John Rutledge and Edward Rutledge, along with Christopher Gadsden, a fiery radical who carried in his heart the spirit that would later fly on the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. New York sent John Jay, young but brilliant, and Philip Livingston, representing the merchant elite who feared the chaos of open conflict. From the small but determined colonies of Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Rhode Island, came men of conviction, lawyers, merchants, ministers, planters, all answering the call. By early September, they began to arrive in Philadelphia, the largest and most cosmopolitan city in America. Its cobblestone streets buzzed with talk of revolution, and taverns overflowed with speculation about what these men might decide. Philadelphia, at the time, was a city unlike any other in the colonies. It was elegant and orderly, filled with brick houses, clean streets, and bustling markets. It was also home to the Carpenter's Hall, a modest but dignified brick building near the Delaware River. This was where, on September 5, 1774, the delegates of the colonies gathered for the first time. They came not as rebels, but as representatives of their people, each bearing the weight of history on their shoulders. No one knew exactly what this Congress would accomplish. Some hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Others, quietly, began to dream of independence. But all understood that the colonies could no longer face the empire alone. Unity was their only hope. On that first morning, the delegates assembled in silence. No flag waved above them, no anthem played, there was no United States yet. Only 13 colonies, uncertain and divided, bound together by fear, anger, and the faint glimmer of hope. Peyton Randolph of Virginia was chosen as president of the Congress, a man known for his calm authority and sense of fairness. His election was symbolic. Virginia, the oldest colony, would preside over the new experiment in unity. The sessions began with a prayer led by the Reverend Jacob Dush, an Anglican clergyman from Philadelphia. Though many delegates were wary, some being Puritans, some Quakers, some skeptics, the prayer struck a deep chord. Dush read from Psalm 35, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me, fight against them that fight against me." As his words echoed through the hall, many of the delegates were moved to tears. Even hardened men like John Adams later wrote that it was one of the most solemn moments of their lives. In that instant, they felt something transcendent, something binding them together beyond politics or region. Over the next few days, the Congress began to debate the question that hung over them all. How should the colonies respond to Britain's oppression? Some, like Patrick Henry, spoke with fire. He rose to his feet and declared, "I am not a Virginian, but an American." It was a radical statement, an identity no one had ever claimed before. His words hung in the air like sparks, igniting imaginations across the room. Others, like Joseph Galloway, urged caution. He proposed a plan of union with Britain, a sort of British-American parliament, that would preserve the empire but grant the colonies greater self-government. But radicals like the Adams cousins and Gadsden saw this as too little, too late. To them, Britain had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The debates were fierce but respectful. The delegates knew that unity was fragile, and that one careless decision could shatter it. They argued late into the night, lit by flickering candles, the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Outside Carpenter's Hall, the people of Philadelphia gathered daily, waiting for news. Newspapers speculated, rumors swirled, and tavern talk grew bold. Some said the Congress would declare war. Others believed they'd surrender. But in truth, the delegates were treading carefully. They knew they were walking a razor's edge between loyalty and rebellion. They needed to show strength, but not yet provoke the wrath of the British Army. Still, one thing became clear to everyone present: America's sense of identity was changing. The colonies were no longer just Massachusetts, or Virginia, or New York. They were beginning to speak, think, and act as one people, united not by geography or trade, but by a shared belief in liberty. This was the dawn of something entirely new, a movement that would soon challenge the mightiest empire on earth. But in 1774, they didn't yet know how far it would go. They only knew that they couldn't turn back. The First Continental Congress had begun. Part 2, The Fire of Debate. The air inside Carpenter's hall was thick with tension. Quills scratched across parchment, candles burned low, and the delegates argued hour after hour, day after day. They weren't just debating policies, they were trying to decide what kind of people they were, and what kind of future they were willing to risk everything for. Every colony had its own story, its own wounds. Some wanted peace. Others whispered of freedom. But all agreed on one thing: the days of blind obedience to the crown were over. The Congress met behind closed doors. They didn't want spies or British loyalists twisting their words. What was said inside that hall would echo across the world, but for now, it had to remain secret. It was not an easy gathering. The colonies were like 13 siblings who had grown up apart and were now forced to sit at the same table for the first time. They shared blood and history, but also suspicion. Massachusetts was angry and defiant. Virginia was proud but cautious. New York and Pennsylvania were prosperous and didn't want to lose their trade. The Carolinas were divided between wealthy planters and restless frontiersmen. In those first weeks, the biggest challenge wasn't Britain, it was each other. No one spoke more passionately than John Adams. To him, the cause of Massachusetts was the cause of all America. He believed that Britain had already declared war on liberty itself. Adams wrote in his diary that the debates were a nursery of American statesmen. Every day, he said, men were growing bolder, stronger, more determined. But even Adams knew that open rebellion could tear the colonies apart if unity failed. He spent countless evenings talking with other delegates, trying to bridge their differences, convincing Southerners that New England's fight was theirs too, persuading moderates that resistance could still be honorable. One afternoon, Patrick Henry rose from his seat. His voice carried through the room like thunder. "Government is dissolved," he cried. "Fleets and armies and the present state of things show that government is dissolved. Where are your landmarks, your boundaries of colonies? They are all thrown down." He paused, scanning the room. "I am not a Virginian," he said slowly, "but an American." For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then murmurs rippled through the hall. For the first time, the words, "an American," carried a sense of destiny. Henry had given them a new identity, one that rose above their separate loyalties. But not everyone was ready to embrace revolution. Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania stood firm against the rising tide. He proposed a plan of union, a compromise that would create an American parliament under British authority. The colonies would govern their internal affairs, while remaining under the protection of the crown. It was a clever plan, moderate, reasonable, and meant to prevent bloodshed. Many delegates listened carefully. War with Britain was a terrifying idea. After all, the colonies were defenseless, untrained, and divided. Britain was the mightiest empire on earth. But men like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Christopher Gadsden saw through Galloway's plan. To them, it was a trap, a gilded cage. Accepting it meant surrendering the principle of self-rule. John Adams later called it a mere snare, a delusion to lull us into submission. When the votes were counted, Galloway's plan was narrowly defeated. It would be stricken from the record, almost erased from memory. But that moment, that razor-thin vote, showed how fragile the road to unity really was. By October, the Congress had grown restless. They had written petitions, exchanged letters, debated endlessly, but what good were words if the Crown refused to listen? The delegates knew they needed something concrete, something that would speak louder than speeches or papers. And so, they began to craft a plan, not for war, not yet, but for economic resistance. The idea was bold, a boycott of British goods. If Britain would not listen to reason, perhaps it would listen to lost profit. It was called the Continental Association, and it became the first true act of American unity. On October 20, 1774, the delegates signed it, every colony represented. Under the association, the colonies agreed to stop importing goods from Britain beginning December 1. If Parliament did not repeal the intolerable acts by the following year, they would stop exporting to Britain as well. Tea, textiles, glass, paper, sugar, all were on the list. They even vowed to stop the import of slaves, marking an early stand against the slave trade. Each colony was to form local committees to enforce the boycott. These committees would inspect merchants, publish the names of violators, and encourage neighbors to buy only American-made goods. They called it the Non-Importation Agreement, but in truth, it was much more than that. It was self-government, built from the ground up. Ordinary men and women now had power in their own hands. Farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and housewives all became guardians of liberty. For the first time, America was acting as one nation, not 13 fragments. Alongside the boycott, the Congress drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a document both firm and respectful. It declared that the colonists were loyal subjects of the king, but entitled to the same rights as Englishmen. It rejected Parliament's authority to tax them without consent and condemned the standing army in peacetime as a threat to liberty. "We ask only for peace, liberty, and security," they wrote. It was not yet a declaration of independence, but the seed was there. It was a polite but unmistakable warning: if Britain continued to trample their rights, America would rise. For a brief, shining moment, the delegates felt a sense of accomplishment. They had done what seemed impossible, brought 13 quarrelsome colonies into one coordinated action. In taverns and churches across the colonies, the news of the Continental Association spread like wildfire. Merchants locked away British goods. Housewives spun homespun cloth. Farmers swore to eat only local produce. The spirit of resistance reached every town, every field, every harbor. When the Congress adjourned in late October, the men embraced one another. They didn't know when, or if, they would meet again. Many suspected they'd return as fugitives or soldiers. Before departing, they agreed on one final resolution. If their petitions were ignored, they would reconvene the next year, this time, ready for whatever came next. They set the date, May 1775. As the delegates packed their bags and left Philadelphia, winter crept across the colonies. In the frozen streets of Boston, British soldiers marched with muskets at their shoulders. In Virginia, militias began to drill in secret. In the taverns of New England, men whispered that the time for talk might soon end. George Washington returned to Mount Vernon and wrote in his diary, "If the British administration mean to force us into a civil war, the sooner the better." John Adams rode north to Massachusetts, knowing that his colony was already at the heart of the storm. Patrick Henry went home to Virginia, his words, "Give me liberty or give me death," not yet spoken, but already burning in his soul. The First Continental Congress had not declared independence. It had not raised an army or fired a shot. But it had done something perhaps even more powerful: it had awakened the idea of America. It taught the colonies to work together, to act together, and to believe that together, they could stand against the empire. It created the first sparks of a national identity, a people united by principle, not geography. As 1774 turned to 1775, those sparks began to glow brighter. Because across the ocean, in London, the King and Parliament were not impressed. They saw the Congress not as a plea for peace, but as an act of defiance. And in response, they prepared the only language they thought rebels understood: force. The delegates had returned home hoping for peace. But peace was already slipping away. The next time they would meet, the Second Continental Congress, they would face a world transformed by gunfire. In Lexington and Concord, the revolution would begin. Part 3, The Road to Revolution. The delegates had gone home. Carpenter's hall was quiet now, the ink dried, the chairs empty, the echo of their voices fading into memory. But outside those walls, the world was changing. The First Continental Congress was over, yet its impact had only just begun. In taverns, churches, and marketplaces, the call for unity spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Across the colonies, people who had once thought of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers now spoke of themselves, cautiously, as Americans. They had read the words of the Congress in newspapers and broadsides. They had heard the sermons echoing from pulpits, "United we stand, divided we fall." Ordinary men and women, farmers, tradesmen, blacksmiths, mothers, all began to take the cause personally. The boycott demanded sacrifice from everyone, rich and poor alike. Imported tea vanished from tables. British textiles were left to rot in warehouses. Homespun clothing became a badge of honor, rougher, simpler, but proudly American. The movement spread into every corner of colonial life. Even the smallest towns formed committees of inspection, local bodies chosen by citizens to enforce the Continental Association. These committees became miniature governments, holding meetings, writing reports, and publicly naming anyone who broke the boycott. They didn't just punish loyalists, they shaped the habits of self-government. Every vote, every meeting, every signed pledge taught Americans to rule themselves. British goods were shunned. British officials were despised. And British soldiers, especially in Massachusetts, became symbols of oppression. When newspapers printed letters from London calling the Congress a seditious meeting, anger boiled over. The Crown's officials dismissed it all as empty posturing, mere talk, they said, but they were wrong. The real power of the Congress was not in its petitions. It was in the people who believed in them. Throughout the winter of 1774 and the early months of 1775, militias began to form across the colonies. Men drilled in village greens, muskets on their shoulders, powder horns gleaming in the cold sun. They called themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. At first, it was only precaution, a show of readiness, not rebellion. But no one could ignore what was coming. In the eyes of many colonists, Britain had become not a protector, but an oppressor. The fires of independence were being kindled, in homes, in hearts, and in the quiet determination of free people. Across the Atlantic, the British government received the Congress's petitions. King George III read them carefully, and then dismissed them with cold resolve. In his eyes, these were not loyal subjects seeking justice. They were rebels, ungrateful children challenging the parent that had raised and protected them. Parliament's reaction was swift. In early 1775, it declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion and ordered General Thomas Gage, the military governor in Boston, to restore order, by force if necessary. British troops began to prepare for action. Supplies were stockpiled, scouts were sent into the countryside, and plans were made to seize colonial weapons. The message from London was clear: obedience or punishment. But America was no longer listening. Meanwhile, in towns across the colonies, people began to hold their own local congresses, miniature versions of the one that had met in Philadelphia. In Massachusetts, the royal government had practically collapsed. British officials found themselves powerless outside Boston, while local committees ran the countryside. They collected taxes, organized militias, and enforced the association with iron discipline. In Virginia, Patrick Henry, George Washington, and other patriots gathered at Williamsburg and later at Richmond, forming conventions that mirrored the Continental Congress itself. In North Carolina, the citizens of Mecklenburg County went even further, declaring in 1775 that their royal government was annihilated, a bold step towards self-rule. The colonies were no longer waiting for permission from the king. They were already governing themselves. In every town meeting, in every election of a committee, Americans were rehearsing independence. By early 1775, the Continental Association had transformed daily life. British imports fell dramatically. Merchants who tried to defy the boycott were publicly shamed, sometimes tarred and feathered, sometimes forced to confess their loyalty to the cause. Women's groups called Daughters of Liberty organized spinning bees, turning out homespun yarn for clothing. Churches held prayers for "our brethren" in Boston, and letters of solidarity crossed the colonies faster than ever before. The colonies had become a web of interdependence, an early version of a nation held together not by a government, but by conviction. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "The people have become more determined than ever. They are united in sentiment, and the union will carry us through. But deep down, Adams knew what was coming. Boycotts and petitions could only delay the inevitable. By the spring of 1775, tension had reached a breaking point. In Boston, General Gage prepared his troops to march on the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord, where colonial militias were said to be storing gunpowder and arms. In the countryside, farmers stood guard at night, listening for the sound of British boots on the road. Rumors spread that the redcoats would soon strike, to seize the weapons, to arrest the Patriot leaders, to crush the rebellion before it could ignite. Meanwhile, word reached the colonies that the king had refused to even read their petition. The message was unmistakable: there would be no reconciliation. The First Continental Congress had hoped for peace. But history had chosen another path. In April 1775, as dawn broke over Massachusetts, British soldiers marched toward Lexington. There, on the village green, a handful of militiamen stood waiting, cold, nervous, uncertain. Someone shouted a command. A shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but in that single moment, the world changed. The shot heard round the world marked the beginning of open war. By the time the smoke cleared, the revolution had begun. As the news spread, bells rang from New Hampshire to Georgia. Men seized their muskets, mustered their militias, and waited for orders. And when the Second Continental Congress gathered the following month, they did not come as petitioners, they came as leaders of a nation at war. The First Continental Congress had not declared independence, but it had prepared America for it. It had shown that 13 colonies, scattered along a vast coast, could act together with purpose. It had trained them to organize, to vote, to communicate, to build a shared vision of liberty. It had created networks of committees and assemblies that would soon become the skeleton of a new government, the United States of America. When the delegates had first gathered in Philadelphia, they were subjects of a king. When they gathered again less than a year later, they were revolutionaries. John Adams would later write, "The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people long before a drop of blood was shed." And it was the First Continental Congress that had lit that fire. In the years that followed, many of those men would rise to even greater heights. George Washington would lead the Continental Army. John Adams would help draft the Declaration of Independence. John Jay would negotiate peace. Patrick Henry would rally Virginia with his immortal cry, "Give me liberty or give me death." And yet, each of them would remember those first days in Philadelphia, the arguments, the prayers, the fear, and the fragile unity that became the seed of a nation. Carpenter's Hall still stands today, silent but immortal, a small brick building that once held the future of a continent within its walls. If you step inside, you can almost hear the echo of quills and voices, men speaking not for a colony, but for a country that did not yet exist. A country that would one day call itself free. The First Continental Congress was not the revolution itself. It was the awakening before the storm. A gathering of minds and hearts who dared to believe that liberty was worth everything, even their lives. From that faith, a nation was born. And the world would never be the same. The end. Like this video, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.